Murat of The Athletic with us here on Winnipeg Sports Talk Daily. Really enjoyed your piece today in The Athletic talking about the upcoming draft. And it's even more intriguing, I think, for Jets fans because of the performance of the Rangers in the playoffs, Murat. And you sort of covered it. It's one thing to pick 14th. It's another thing to have another pick in that first round. Listen, dream scenario, the Kyle Connor, Jack Roslovic draft back in, 2015. Tell us a little bit about what you were doing with your colleagues at The Athletic, digging into not the first pick at 14, but what might be left for the Winnipeg Jets late first round with that pick acquired in the Andrew Copp trade.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. I was going through, you project how the board is going to go based on scouts rankings, based on the intel that, people much closer to those situations than myself have gathered. And you try to guess who's going to be available. You compare that to Winnipeg's prospect pool needs, Winnipeg's history, the types of picks that they like to make. And you sort of come up with your long list of players who a team like the Jets could take at 30th overall. Thank you, Andrew Copp and the New York Rangers, for making it as far as you did. There's so many variables at play that I approached Corey Proman with a list of 20 players saying, you know what, this is like, please help me cut some from this because the board could go so many different ways. I think any one of these people could be a realistic shot for the team at 30. And he just laughed at me. He said, that's what these guys are dealing with. This is the realistic way in the NHL. I mean, somebody who the Jets have ranked in the top 15 could well make it into the second round. And there have been some discrepancies in that kind of value before. So that makes it interesting in and of itself, the types of players that are going to be available. But also, there's a philosophical discussion to have. How much does the player that Winnipeg takes at 14 impact who they're able to take at 30? If they're able to get sort of a blue chip prospect who everybody thinks is going to make the NHL, like a Connor Geekie at 14th overall, does that mean that you're willing to gamble perhaps with, Ivan Miroshnichenko, whose name I may have struggled with right there, who is thought of as having a top 10 talent set, but whose health has been an issue, and some folks will be concerned about him playing in Russia as well, but who has such an incredibly high ceiling. Do you treat them independently? If you end up with a defenseman like Denton Matachuk or Korchinski or Minchukov with the 14th pick, does that mean you go for a forward later? All of those sorts of different permutations. In the end, I was able to cut it to a list of approximately 13 skaters who I think that the Jets would have a reasonable odds at taking. And there's some quality in there too at this point.
I love that point because we have seen when you have the benefit of having a couple picks, you can sort of take a swing. And I would say the Winnipeg Jets did exactly that with the Logan Stanley selection. I mean, they knew they had their blue chip guy in Patrick Laine. They had this additional pick. They thought that this player had a ton of potential to be a guy that they could really lean on. And, they took him there. It was far from a guarantee. And I'm not sure that same decision is made if you didn't already have the pick that was in the bank with the blue chip number two overall selection.
Yeah, and for me, that's so interesting because theoretically, every single one of these picks is independent of the other one, right? Like if there's a best player available, you take that player. If you believe in drafting for players with upside over having a high floor, low ceiling, then presumably that is the best play regardless. But I don't think that's how it works in the real world. I think that, as people, when you feel like you've hit a home run already, you're more willing to gamble. I think Logan Stanley is a great example of that. They were willing to take their time. They knew if Logan Stanley was going to hit, it wasn't going to be the following season like with Patrick Laine, and they're willing to make a play like that in that situation. At the same time, I think in 2015, Jack Roslovic was just the highest rated player on the board. So it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. I guess another sort of philosophical thing too is positionally, you would think Winnipeg has its defense set in terms of the prospects. We've talked about how Manitoba Moose is loaded with Heinola, Sandberg, Chisholm, Gavanka, even perhaps Kovacevic perhaps as well. But we know in Winnipeg that the roster today may not be the roster in 4 or 5 years. We know that very, very well. So Winnipeg scouts have their jobs absolutely cut out for them. There are some forwards I like in that 30 range, like Jimmy Snuggerud or Isaac Howard. I don't think is going to last that long. There are some opportunities for forwards to score a lot. I'm not sure how keen they are to take Russian players necessarily, but Miroshnichenko has made it to 30 in our mock drafts at the Athletic a couple of times, and that's tempting to pass up on. There's also the possibility, Huss, and I don't know that this is front burner, of making trades, because the Jets are very well aware that they haven't been able to pick a lot of times in the last several years, since approximately 2017 till now. And that's one of the reasons why I think they're more likely to take the Blues second round pick as part of the Andrew Copp return this year, as opposed to the Rangers return next year. I think that having players in the pipeline will be helpful. If they don't do that, or even if they do, that 30 could become 2 late second round picks, which analytically tends to be good value as well. There are so many things that could happen with that pick that's why you write a 4,000 word piece in an attempt to guess at some of them.
Hey, just quickly on that decision, the Jets, do we know when, do they basically make the decision on the draft floor at that point? Is there a point, do they have to let them know before the draft happens? I'm fascinated as to that decision, whether it's something that they can literally make just before the pick, or do they have to declare their intentions in advance?
It's in advance. So I have a team source on that says within 48 hours of the end of the Stanley Cup playoffs. So we'll have the draft order set, and then the Jets get 2 days to think about it.
One other question. You mentioned a couple Russian players. From talking to people within the league as well as scouts, what's happening geopolitically? How will that affect the draft? And how many teams, and I'm not sure whether the Winnipeg Jets are part of this group or not, will shy away from Russian players because of everything else happening outside of the hockey rink?
Yeah, that's such a tough discussion. And I want to approach it with respect for the fact that, not only will there be people with Russian descent in listening to this, but also in Manitoba, we have such an enormous and wonderful Ukrainian community as well. And I want to be able to discuss it with some empathy for that. I haven't seen too many examples in the NHL where geopolitics have impacted player picks. This is not the same thing as Logan Mailloux in Montreal a couple of years back, for example, but it seems as though within the league, player quality or upside, if the player is good enough, people are willing to overlook a lot of things. And that's even before trying to dissect, well, what quote unquote should a team do in this situation? Is a 17 and a half or 18-year-old kid somehow, to bear responsibility for the geopolitical situation, a war going on? Even if they're not, is there some symbology in that? Symbolism, pardon me. So I don't know how to navigate that necessarily. I read Corey Pronman's wonderful piece at The Athletic called it a Draft Confidential, where he actually polls anonymous scouts and executives. And there seems to be a group of executives who think that teams will shy away to some degree on Russian products in the draft, but not so much that the top players like Danila Yurov, for example, or Minchukov on defense, or Miroshnichenko, who was thought of as a top 10 talent before Hodgkin's diagnosis. He's been cleared to return to play in June, I believe. So those are some really high quality players. And I don't think that they're going to make it all the way through the draft. Those are first round talents. But will they go a little bit later than maybe otherwise they should? I'm not sure, because some teams may have them on a do not draft type of list. In Winnipeg's case, I think that the official policy has always been we don't draft by passport. Even when they were drafting all those Finnish players, it was, well, that was the best player on our board. It's not like we're trying to create a new Finland over here. And I think that that's likely, the policy as well. The scouts will put together their lists and they'll watch the board break as it does. And if a player is too good to pass up, they might not. But at the same time, it does seem to be a delicate situation, especially in Winnipeg with the Ukrainian population that we have.
The one thing that I will say, and I have no idea how the Jets are thinking about this going in, but with that selection at the end of the first round, I would say that far more likely this year than in the past that those sort of influences might create a fall for a player being available at a spot like number 30, as opposed to earlier in the draft when the talent says that they might take it. And that could create some interesting opportunities, at least for Winnipeg and the other teams picking towards the end of the first round.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree with that, because some of the ranges that these guys are suggested to go in are kind of in that early teens sort of list. Like if you just look based on talent and the projections before, I'll use Miroshnichenko again as an example in this situation. If you look at where scouts were rating him, Bob McKenzie's list from January has him in the top 10. And so do Pronman. Pronman, I believe, had him top 5 heading into the season in terms of raw talent. Scott Wheeler's enamored with him as well. Though he's not a perfect player, but this is a top 10 type of talent. Well, maybe Winnipeg doesn't swing at 14, or another team that has multiple first-round picks. Maybe that player is able to pass through a little bit. But if they have a second pick, that's that kind of situation where maybe they're a little bit more willing to go. And by the time that you're reaching the 30th, 31st, 32nd picks, I mean, some of the value propositions in that kind of thing might be just too good to pass up. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure how to project how that shakes out.